Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. The first of 7 public hearings on the January 6th Select Committee kicked off last night, and what was presented to the American people was spectacular evidence that American democracy was deliberately attacked. Joining me now, Leanne Caldwell, anchor at Washington Post Live and co-author of the early 202 newsletter. Welcome, Leanne, to First Look.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. I'm so glad to be here.
So there's so many stunning revelations last night. What were the headlines for you from last night's hearings?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, the committee actually did a better than I expected job last night. Perhaps my expectations were so low after covering this hearing or this committee for so long. But they really laid out what is going to happen over the next few weeks in these committee hearings. And at the center of it, they say, is the former president, Donald Trump, that they laid out from the very beginning. They made it very clear that he was told on many occasions that he did not win the election. He was told that by his top advisors. He was told that by his own attorney general, and that even his daughter believed that he did not win the election. And still, the committee says that he moved forward with this scheme, with this plan to stay in power on January 6th. And so, what the committee did a really effective job of is using the depositions, video of his top advisors in their own words. It was kind of a really good tactic. Instead of the lawmakers reading from these depositions, instead they played the video from these depositions, and so there was no room for interpretation. Of course, it
Mhm.
was just snippets, but I think it did a good job of painting the picture of the pushback that the former president got in the lead up to January 6th.
And we also heard we got live testimony yesterday from 2 witnesses, dramatic testimony from Nick Quested, the British filmmaker who was embedded with the Proud Boys, and Capitol Hill police officer Caroline Edwards. Here's Officer Edwards in her own words.
What I saw was just a war scene. It was something like I'd seen out of the movies. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were officers on the ground, you know, they were bleeding, they were throwing up, they were, they had, I saw friends with blood all over their faces.
Leanne, talk about the significance of that testimony.
Yeah, it was tragic. That testimony, so it was interesting because while the committee, on the one hand, as we just discussed, really tried to paint the picture of how the former president, was at the center of this, they also used this really emotional, gripping testimony to paint a picture of what happened on that day and the trauma that these officers went through. And especially Caroline Anderson, she had dealt directly with the far right extremists, the Proud Boys and their group. She had confronted them, and so they wanted the public to be reminded that this was not a normal tourist day at the Capitol, but that officers were in battle. They were in battle to protect the building, to protect the democracy. And I think that she did, her testimony was just really astonishing.
Mhm. Among the things we also saw was video of the moment when she was attacked and hit her head and was unconscious on the Capitol steps. And I want to correct something that I said in the intro. There are 8 total hearings. So the first of 8 hearings kicked off last night. The second one will be on Monday morning at 10 a.m. Leanne, you interviewed Congressman Jamie Raskin, who was part of the second impeachment. He is on the January 6th Select Committee. You interviewed him on Monday for Post Live, and you asked him if then Vice President Mike Pence's life was in danger that day, to which he cryptically replied, quote, "Watch the hearings." We watched the hearings, Leanne. What did they reveal in that regard?
Well, the committee last night foreshadowed, I think, what they're going to get into when last night they said that when Donald Trump was told that, Mike Pence's life could be in danger, that Donald Trump responded, well, maybe he deserves it. And so that we know that the fourth hearing, excuse me, that's going to be on Thursday is going to focus a lot on Mike Pence. And so I suspect they will get a lot deeper into that. We are going to hear from Jacobs, one of Pence's top legal counsels leading up to January 6th, where he was firm pushing back against the president's team, saying that Mike Pence has no authority to overturn the elections during the Electoral College counting of the votes or certification of the votes on January 6th. And he was firm with the vice president that he had no role as well. We're also waiting to see if we're going to hear from other people of Mike Pence's team, including his chief of staff, Mark Short. And there's still some speculation that perhaps Mike Pence will testify. I don't think it's going to happen, but Thursday, I think, is going to be where we hear a lot more about Mike Pence's role that day and the threat to his life.
And in the front page story, in the story on the front page of the Washington Post this morning, when Liz Cheney read that Donald Trump said Mike Pence maybe he deserves it, there was an audible gasp in the hearing room when that was read aloud. How much of an earthquake was Congresswoman Cheney's revelation that Congressman Scott Perry, among other members of Congress, sought pardons from Donald Trump in the days after the January 6th insurrection?
Yeah, as someone who covers Congress, that is a storyline that I am extremely interested in because we know that Scott Perry and others, including, I don't want to lump Scott Perry and Kevin McCarthy in the same boat on their roles on January 6th, but they were both subpoenaed by the January 6th Select Committee to provide information, and neither one have done so. And so the fact that, again, the committee last night teased that Scott Perry and perhaps others asked for pardons leading up to January 6th, the importance of that is because that insinuates that there is a recognition by Scott Perry and others that what they were doing was wrong and perhaps illegal. And so, despite that, they still moved forward. There were reporters last night, including our colleagues at the Washington Post, Jackie Alamany and Mariana Sotomayor, who asked the committee members after the hearing to provide more information about those pardons, and they wouldn't do so yet. So once again, I suspect that's going to be a big storyline moving forward.
The Post had a story this week that the Secret Service explored the possibility of securing a route to the Capitol on January 6th so that Trump could join the protesters. What do we know about why he wanted to
hmm
do that?
Yeah, well, what the committee, I think, is going to try to connect is that Donald Trump was very involved in the directing people to the Capitol. Um, that is very likely going to be in the last two hearings where the committee members say that they are going to lead up to what happened on that day, but also on an hour by hour, minute by minute on January 6th. And I think that it's important for the committee to show that Donald Trump was not, it wasn't coincidental that he was taking to Twitter and calling his followers to come to Washington, that it wasn't coincidental that he was on the ellipsis on January 6th, saying that they need to fight and that they need to march to the Capitol. And so, we'll see how all of this unfolds. But the central point of the committee is to connect Donald Trump to all of these actions, that it did not happen in a vacuum, that it had a leader.
One of the things that came out of the hearing that I heard that Liz Cheney talked about was we know about there's a one meeting between then President Trump, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, Mike Flynn in the Oval Office, But what Congresswoman Cheney revealed was that there was another meeting between Trump and those folks that Trump's own staff did not know about, and they
Yeah.
ran to the Oval to get into the room. And what was significant about that was that apparently about an hour or so after that secret meeting was when Donald Trump put out that tweet, the infamous tweet, where at the end it's, come to Washington, will be wild. Leanne Caldwell, you and I could talk all day about just hearing number one, but we've got 7 more to go apparently. So we will see you soon. Leanne Caldwell, anchor at Washington Post Live and co-author of the early 202 newsletter. Thank you for coming to First Look, and have a good weekend.
Thanks. You too, Jonathan.
We're going to keep the conversation going with our opinions roundtable in a moment. Let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post deputy editorial page editor Ruth Marcus and Washington Post columnist George Will. Welcome back to First Look.
Glad to be
Good
with
morning,
you.
Jonathan.
So, in a hearing filled with dramatic testimony, one of the most searing remarks came from Vice Chair Liz Cheney. Let's have a listen.
Tonight, I say this to my Republican colleagues who are defending the indefensible. There will come a day when Donald Trump is gone, but your dishonor will remain.
George, I'll start with you. Just overall, your reactions to the first hearing of the January 6th Select Committee.
Well, you just referred to it, as we all do, as a hearing. But a hearing usually means that the committee is gathered to hear something. This was a telling last night, not a hearing. They wanted to tell the country something that it thinks the country needs to know. And the informing function of Congress is a legitimate one. You don't need to have a clear legislative purpose to have a hearing like this. Their problem was that we basically know the story. This isn't like Watergate. Watergate wanted to learn something. That was a hearing, typified by Howard Baker's famous question. The Tennessee Republican senator said, the question is, what did the president know and when did he know it? And the Watergate committee set about trying to find things. Indeed, they found in the process of their inquiry the existence of the Oval Office taping system, and that was the end of the Nixon presidency. The committee last night, I think, did something excellent. They said, look, we all saw the burglary, if you will. The heart of the Watergate was a burglary. We saw the riot. And my sense is that in the next 7 hearings, they're going to work backward to establish the planning that went into this, perhaps the financing that went into this, and the number of people involved. This, again, will not surprise us. I think it's a mistake to say, gosh, we're seeing evidence of Donald Trump's planning. Donald Trump couldn't plan breakfast. We know that Donald Trump's mind flits about like a bee around flowers. I don't think he really plans things. I think he improvised on that day, and will look plenty guilty, but I think it's, again, wrong to ascribe to him forethought.
Ruth, a problem, a mistake? Does it matter that we're not, quote unquote, learning anything new? Isn't it important that we get these things on the record?
100%. I think it's important that we get these things on the record. And I think that George and I are in agreement on that. But I think we're also in agreement that this is horrifying what we heard and witnessed last night, whether it was a hearing or a telling. It's chilling what the president, and I would disagree slightly with George because he's not a very good planner, but he is a planner and a plotter, and he had enough intent to undo the known results of the election to hold him morally responsible, if not criminally responsible, and potentially criminally responsible. But my main takeaway from last night and what appears to be coming is not just the horrifying and chilling aspect of it, but the frustratingly incomplete aspect of it. This is not Watergate in the sense that in Watergate, as George noted, we had the tapes. In Watergate, we had testimony important testimony from people who were right around the president himself. Here, and this is not a criticism in any way of the committee, which has done its damnedest to try to get this information, but they aren't able to get Mark Meadows. They aren't able, shamefully, to get Kevin McCarthy or Scott Perry or others at the very center. And so they're doing what investigators and prosecutors have to do, which is they're working from people who are a ring away from the absolute inside. And we're getting a damning story, and it's important to get that, but it's also frustrating that we're not getting more.
You talk about the significance of former Attorney General William Barr's blunt assessment that the voter fraud charges that Donald Trump was leveling at the time were a quote barnyard expletive, George.
Well, Mr. Barr is agreeably blunt, and what he said will make no difference whatever to the people. I guess they're 70% of the self-described Republicans think the election was in some sense stolen. And people who still believe that after 60-some court defeats of this proposition aren't going to be dissuaded by the fact that Bill Barr says this. All this will mean to those people is that Bill Barr is part of the deep state, that he too has gone over to the dark side, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Ruth, and I understand what. Oh, George, did you have more to say? I'm sorry.
That's quite all right.
I understand what George is saying in terms of, whatever Bill Barr says isn't going to change the minds of Trump supporters. But does it matter to change the mind of Trump supporters? Again, I keep coming back to, isn't it important that we have what he says on the record, if not for the immediate future, but for history?
I am a very big believer, along with you, that the importance here is something that Liz Cheney invoked, which is the memory of history and the legacy of the record of this in history. And so if the goal of this hearing is to change minds, it is almost certain, for the reasons that George said, to fail. I don't think that's the goal of the hearing. The goal of the hearing is to amass evidence, expand the available evidence, get it out on the record in one place. I would point out that that barnyard expletive, bull, I'm not going to say the whole word, is something that we've heard from the former Attorney General before as he went on his book tour. So it is powerful to hear it. It was powerful to hear it last night, but we knew that was his assessment really from the moment even before he resigned as Attorney General.
Jonathan,
right. Go ahead, George.
We've been talking about how this is in some ways not analogous to the Watergate hearings. It's also analogous to the Warren Commission after the Kennedy assassination. There were all kinds of rumors and conspiracy theories and speculations going around, and it was very important that the government put the prestige of former Chief Justice Earl Warren and others behind refuting those. The second gunman on the grassy knoll and all of that. So the Warren Commission was basically, as both you and Ruth are saying, was to build the record, and doing so to throw some of the things off the record permanently, that there was a vast conspiracy, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a necessary and a sufficient justification for what the committee is doing.
One more thing that we heard, and there was reporting about this at the time, was Congresswoman Liz Cheney saying during the hearing last night that Trump's reaction to the "Hang Mike Pence" chant was, quote, "Maybe our supporters have the right idea. Mike Pence, quote, deserves it." We'll love your reaction to that, Ruth.
Has a president of the United States, a sitting president of the United States, ever said a more chilling, more irresponsible, honestly, more evil thing than that? I can't think of one. That's my reaction.
George?
Well, I agree if you take him seriously, but we have to understand he just this is just noise from Mr. Trump. He just says these things. Again, I'm just reluctant to ascribe to him thought and planning and seriousness. There's a deep shallowness to him that should be.
He is invested with all of the power of the commander-in-chief and the president of the United States to. I understand what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying about his limits and kind of mental incapacity, but that does not excuse. I don't think we disagree. Actually, that just does not excuse it in any way.
No, I'm not excusing it. All I'm saying is it has limited capacity to frighten me because there's no follow through from him.
I mean, I don't know. Ever since he came down that escalator on June 16th, 2015, I have taken him seriously and literally. And to hear that he said the vice president of the United States deserved the hang Mike Pence chant and what that could have resulted in, I agree with Ruth, was evil. Ruth, you're the George. Are you a lawyer?
No,
Okay, Ruth
I
is a
would like
lawyer.
to point out,
I'm
George
guilty
gets
of, but not that.
George gets, without denigrating George in any way by ascribing a law degree to him, he gets to play a lawyer on First Look and on the pages of the Washington Post op-ed page as much as he
Right.
wants, because he knows a lot of law.
Right. Well, I bring that up because you're the lawyer on the panel, Ruth, and I'm just wondering the significance of Vice Chair Cheney revealing that Congressman Scott Perry and other members of Congress sought a pardon from then President Trump in the aftermath of January 6th.
I'm not sure that it has legal significance as much as it has moral significance, an understanding and a tacit, if not explicit, acknowledgement that they understood that what they were doing was wrong, that what they were doing could, if fully understood, expose themselves to legal liability. People who are proud of their behavior don't seek pardons for it.
What do you make of that revelation, George?
A guilty mind on their part, as Ruth says. And I think when they looked around and saw what had happened and what they'd been swept up in, this kind of whirlwind, they said, this is not going to look good tomorrow morning. So I understand why they did it. Ruth's quite right that they realized that they had done something pretty awful. Mobs do that. I mean, mobs are while they're mobs, are intoxicated, and this was the beginning of the hangover.
George, I would love to say that I heard everything that you said, but we had a little bit of a hiccup on this end. So I'm just going to think that what you said is, as usual, erudite and worthy of consideration. Ruth, let's talk about the switch gears and talk about Justice Kavanaugh, because there was a serious threat to the Supreme Court justice this week after police nabbed an armed man who made his way to Justice Kavanaugh's home with the intent to kill him. You wrote a column about the circumstances surrounding this, including the protests in front of Kavanaugh's homes, the peaceful protests. What is the balance between First Amendment right to protest versus personal security for public officials like judges?
Well, I think that while I disagree morally and instrumentally with the tactic of protesting at justices' homes, to expand on that, I think it's unnecessary and counterproductive and uncivil. And I know I'm going to annoy a lot of people by saying that, to protest at justices' homes. However, what allegedly happened in the plotting of this California man to assassinate a sitting Supreme Court justice because he disagreed with where it appears Justice Kavanaugh is coming out on Roe, where he thought Justice Kavanaugh, by the way, was coming out on gun regulation. That is entirely different from what had been peaceful, if unwise and uncivil, protests at Justice Kavanaugh's home. We need to take this really, really seriously. We need to make sure that justices and their families, and if necessary, their clerks, are given enough protection, all the protection that is necessary to prevent anything like this from happening, that the Supreme Court police has the necessary, not just money, but the necessary powers to take care of them. And then we need to step back and think, what is it about our culture and our rhetoric and our language and our anger that impels people on both sides? Look, it would be horrible, horrible, horrible if any sitting Supreme Court justice or former Supreme Court justice were attacked or assassinated. It is also true that people on the other side from this deranged individual have done terrible things like bombing abortion clinics or killing abortion providers. All of this is terrible, and we need to take a look at our rhetoric and understand two things simultaneously. Crazy people on both sides will do crazy things, but also we need to be careful not to contribute in ramping them up.
George, I'd love your take.
Chuck Schumer addressed a crowd protesting in front of the Supreme Court across the street from where Chuck Schumer works, in which he said, mentioning Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh by name, that Kavanaugh was going to reap the whirlwind if he didn't mend his ways. This again, Ruth's right. I mean, we are just injecting, but as a kind of IV drip into the veins of the country, a poison of acceptable rhetoric that didn't used to be acceptable. And we should understand. A few days ago, a retired judge in Wisconsin was assassinated by someone who seems to have had a list of people he wanted to assassinate, including the governor of Michigan and Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell. And we just have to begin to take seriously the fact that there are 331 million people in this country. Small number of them are highly suggestible and stark raving mad. And we have to be careful not to add to the atmosphere that prompts these people to act out.
And Ruth mentions Senator Schumer's comments. Ruth, did you want to jump in again?
Well, no, I didn't just mention Senator Schumer's comments. I criticized them. That is not helpful. It is not appropriate. You can't draw a direct line from that to this event, but you can say, in a country that has deranged people, we do not need to be spinning them up. I also mentioned in the column that I wrote that eerily, oddly, Justice Kavanaugh himself had used that same reap the whirlwind language about Democrats at his confirmation hearings. So I think there is blame aplenty, and it comes from excesses on both sides.
George, I want to end this conversation by switching gears one more time real quick to Ukraine, because there is a war going on. You had a column this week warning supporters of Ukraine against hesitancy in supporting that beleaguered country. What's your concern?
My concern is that Putin may be proven right in his obvious assumption that the West does not have the stamina that he has as an autocrat who can press ahead unrestrained by public opinion. This week, French President Macron said we must be careful not to humiliate Putin. I don't think that's really the principal word we ought to have at this point. We ought to help the Ukrainians win defining victory modestly as something like the status quo ante with regard to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Let's worry about that before we worry about Putin's psyche.
Mm-hmm. And with that, we're going to leave it. We're going to leave it there. George Will, Ruth Marcus, thank you both, as always, very much for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
All right, and as always, thank you for joining us. Head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more information about next week's interviews and to register. I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at The Washington Post. Thank you for watching First Look, or Washington Post Live's First Look.